Again, thank you for the organizers for inviting me and the sponsors for putting this on tonight. I'm Ken Buesseler. I'm a scientist. I'm an oceanographer. I work in Woods Hole, which is a couple of hours south of here on the coast, Cape Cod, for some of you who've been there. And I want to take you through a few slides and talk about what the impact was of this disaster on our oceans and the connections between what happened in Japan and what's happening today on the west coast of North America 5 years later. So we're going to take you from before the disaster. We saw the video at the start. Our response, we were there in late May of 2011 with a research cruise. That's a ship from the University of Hawaii in Yokohama Harbor up there. And then we'll get to some of the effort we're doing now with crowdfunding, engaging people to help us both collect and fund some of this type of research. So I'm going to try and cover those topics for you in the brief moments we have. So I just want to remind you of kind of what happened. We saw some film footage, but basically the reactors sit on the coastline. When the earthquake hit, tsunami reached the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plants. There was a loss of power and overheating that occurred because the backup power was also destroyed the generators. And you saw releases. You saw those explosive releases, the hydrogen gas, the buildup of a hot radioactive material that comes out of the atmosphere. Fortunately, most of, we call this the atmospheric fallout or deposition, went towards the ocean. About 80% of it fell on the ocean, not back on land. But that was the initial release. That's what you were seeing pictures of. And that's why they were actually trying to drastically cool this down, drop the water on top, bring in the firefighters, and cool that down. It's very heroic efforts that actually stopped this from being much worse. So the second number up there is a direct discharge. Those heroic efforts meant that water was put on a site that was radioactive, so that water itself becomes radioactive, the buildings were flooded, and that flows into the ocean. And in fact, the peak of that, I'll show some numbers, was a little bit later, a couple weeks later, early April, before the maximum amount of radioactivity was leaking from this site, this reactor on the coastline, into the ocean. And that's what we call direct discharge. And that was, we haven't yet reached the 5th anniversary. That'll be April 6th for the maximum levels in the ocean. What is continuing to this day is some of the fallout, of course, fell on land, and that's what we are concerned about in terms of human health, but it also comes back down through the oceans with the rivers. We're working with Japanese scientists, some of our own researchers looking at that river flow, the runoff. And then lastly, the groundwater component. These last two are much, much smaller than what happened 5 years ago, but they continue to this day. Water is still leaking into the oceans that is radioactive, contaminated from the activities on site during this decommissioning process that will take decades. So the first question is, how much is it? Should we be concerned? And I'm going to try and show these in a couple of different ways. The units as an oceanographer, you probably can't even read up there, 4,500 is the biggest circle. This is the timeline, 2011 on the left, 2016. And this is just a very small selection. This is, I've been there 7 times in my lab group. And every time we go, we measure cesium in this case, an isotope called 137 cesium, and we see how much is there. So the size of the circle tells you we saw a lot more in 2011. You might imagine right after this was getting into the ocean, 2 months later, levels were higher, 4,500. I was there as recently as last October. 200 is the number up there on the far right. So it's gone down, but what I want to show you is a little dot up there that you probably can't even see in the back, which is before that number was 2. So I was measuring 4,500 of these units. It's a becquerel, it's a decay event per second. We kind of done this to ourselves in my field. We use lots of different units, but this becquerel is used commonly for concentrations in food or in the ocean. And we've gone from 2 of these units to 4,500. We're seeing 200 today, so comments about, if you've been reading in the last couple of weeks, that this is still getting into the ocean are borne out by our type of data, this type of research. But I also want to put those circles in perspective of what I fortunately was not experiencing is the big yellow circle. 50 million of those units was the maximum level in the ocean at Fukushima Daiichi. And when we saw some of those data before I went, when I was trying to raise the funds, put the people together, that's a very dangerous number. That's when you can have direct harm to marine biota, reproductive effects, and death. Had it stayed that high, so we went from that big yellow circle to the blue circle within about 2 months, the consequences would have been much more severe. They were able to not only cool down the reactors over time, but plug some of the serious leaks. Not all of them. It's still ongoing to this day. What we have to realize, if there's any take-home message here, is we've gone from what were some of the, I call use words like unprecedented, some of the highest numbers we've ever seen in the ocean, right there at Fukushima Daiichi, the numbers that continue to this day but are at much lower. And I'll try and put what I mean by lower in perspective in the next slide. So I showed you these circles getting smaller. I showed you how bad it was. If you look right in the ocean near the site, there's a small map of Japan, if you can see it. There's actually thousands of data points for cesium, the same isotope 137 in the ocean. I've kind of hidden them behind these colors, which actually don't show up too well. But in those same units, we have tens of millions at the start. It's another timeline, March 11 on the left, January 2015. This plot ends around last fall. And every little dot behind there, and I didn't want you to actually see those too well, but notice that people are collecting samples. It's not just 7 cruises. This is a heroic effort to actually do some of this monitoring. But at that site, it went down. But so you get up to about 1 million, that's that scale on the left there. That's when I'm really worried about being in the ocean, being a fish, being someone swimming there. And we got out of that pretty quickly. That's very good news. It started to drop off into the, so that's a red zone. That color is not showing up well. That's what I call the direct effects. The yellow zone's kind of in the middle, from 1,000 to 1 million. We were there for a long time. When people were talking about, is this under control, we were saying no, and to this day, there's still a release that's very difficult to control. But we're in a yellow zone where the organisms that live there will not be directly effective. You did not see death of marine life. But we had to shut down, the Japanese government had to shut down those fisheries, but there's concern when you internalize a fish that has levels of cesium, and from swimming in water like that, you would internalize cesium and get a higher effective dose that would cause health effects. So Japanese set for themselves a very low standard for cesium in food products, including fish. And during this period when the dots are above that line, that middle zone, fish swimming in waters of that level of cesium would be unfit according to the Japanese standards for seafood consumption. And we're just kind of getting out of that around this 1,000 becquerels per cubic meter. I showed you 200 was the last highest sample I've seen. So we're getting to a point where things are much better, and you're actually well below what's considered safe for even drinking for humans. That's 7,400 in these units. So we have to really watch out when we talk about cesium. It's like other contaminants. How much you internalize or expose to, how long you're exposed to them matter, and these concentrations. The difference here is sort of like the temperature on Earth versus the interior of the sun. You know, these are huge differences in magnitude. So we are going to be exposed to small levels of radioactivity for decades, but at least we're not exposed to levels that we have to worry as much about internalizing them. So when you look at seafood, if you're doing those studies, and the Japanese Ministry of Fisheries has done many, many analyses, tens of thousands of fish up and down the coastline. 2011, half of the fish were above this safety limit that Japan set, 100 becquerels per kilogram for cesium, these isotopes. This is a slide we made up a year ago, and a lot of this information's in this little handout if you want to be reminded, but they were down to about 1% in 2014. So that's the good news as far as reopening fisheries. It's not, it changes with the fish type. Some fish have higher levels than others, but vast improvements. And then on our west coast, people were concerned, I think rightly so, about radioactivity. We're seeing none of the fish have any additional cesium that would put them above a safety limit. So on our coastline, we have not seen this yet. Let me So why should Americans be worried about this? And that's kind of what struck me 2, 3 years ago when we were going to Japan as often as we could, get funded to go as much as we could do. But up here is a movie from NASA showing some of these white squiggles, and these are ocean currents. And, you know, we think of ocean currents sometimes as a straight line. Well, they're not. These are these beautiful, in some ways, can we hit that again, patterns where the oceans, what you see in the bright white there close to Japan is the Kuroshio current. So that's moving across, carrying that radiation to our coastline some 5,000 miles away. But no one was measuring what was happening on our side. We could tell them the levels would be low, but no one had made measurements. So we set up that crowdfunding site. I went a little bit quick here, but it's called Our Radioactive Ocean, and invited people, okay, if you are concerned, I share those concerns, why don't you go to the beach, families, surfers, schools, collect samples, it's quite easy to do, but also pay the $500, $600 it takes my lab to analyze it. And we went from a blank map to 250 data points up and down the coast from San Diego to Alaska and Hawaii. And the scale on this, you'll be happy to hear, the white dots are something less than you can even detect in my lab. We have some of the most sensitive techniques to measure cesium in the ocean. The orange dots are 2 in those units, back to about what it was off Japan before this accident. So we're seeing it, the headlines come in, it's 2, it's 10. If it was 10 in those units, you could swim an entire year in that water. Your additional dose, your health concern, would be about 1,000 times less than the health concern from one dental X-ray. So 2 is different than 50 million. Last couple of slides, just in words to make sure I say a few points here. Fukushima is an unprecedented release to the ocean. Chernobyl was much further from the ocean, so we didn't have the same effects. Japan is leading these studies. We are there as international collaborators to help build confidence in those data and support that effort. And Fukushima fallout will be coming across the ocean with those currents at levels that are probably not 0, but they're similar to what we've experienced before. And by that I mean in the 60s when we tested atomic weapons in the atmosphere, we also put for the first time cesium, plutonium, strontium in the ocean. And on the final slide, what I worry about the most, you know, I do have concerns. The site contains about 1,000 tanks of high-level radioactive, essentially waste. That's being processed, that's being cleaned up. But there's been leaks, and for other isotopes besides cesium, we focus a lot on the isotope that was the most abundant. Strontium was about 40 times less, but it's in those tanks and it's coming out, and we are trying to measure things more than just cesium. The second point, the fisheries agencies have done a good job of measuring tens of thousands of fish, but that's not really enough. You want to know what's coming down the rivers, what's moving offshore. As an oceanographer, what are those currents doing? And so you have to get into the ocean side, the science of this, to learn more about when will they be below these levels. And the final point, I think, and there's a lot of human stories here about the decommissioning, the thousands of people who work every day at that site, their exposure, the safety of that, the cost, tens and tens of billions of dollars, the decades it will take to fully get a melted fuel out of some situation they can't even get to. Robots have been actually breaking down because of their high exposure. People can't get in there. And then this last question about when will the families be able to return back to their homes. 100,000 plus people are being asked to perhaps move back. Well, is that a good idea? Is this risk? You know, I've been showing you there's always some risk. There's always some cesium in the ocean on land before Fukushima Daiichi. When will it be safe? And that's a very difficult question to answer. It's almost a personal choice. But what we try and do is provide at least information on what's out there to help people make that type of decision. So that's the first thing I want to say. The last thing I want to say. Sorry. Thank you.